is back. Tak is back. Tak is back. I've got no clue why, but Tak and the Power of Juju is a franchise that holds a weirdly significant place in my heart. Maybe it's the fact I never actually owned any of the games growing up, only looking at its box art wistfully in magazine advertisements. Maybe it's the unique designs of the characters. Maybe it's the fact that I just love mascot platformers. Or maybe it's because I had the complete set of McDonald's Happy Meal toys because of a childhood sleepover party I had for my 9th birthday. Whatever it is, I get unreasonably excited about this long forgotten franchise. I didn't even love the original home console Tak game. I thought it was okay, but it was so inferior to the surprisingly good GBA port. Despite that, my Tak fever is red hot once again. Let's take a look at Tak 2: The Staff of Dreams. My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. While covering the first set of Tak games not too long ago, my interest in the series grew the more I delved into its background. I knew it was notorious for being Nickelodeon's first foray into launching a franchise via a game rather than a show, something Disney would copy with Spectrobes a handful of years later. Add that franchise to the list of weird, nostalgic, mid-2000s things I want a revival for. Hell, add Invisimals into the mix too. Learning about how the idea for Tak was festering for almost a decade before Power of Juju's release fascinated me, and I'd still love to get to the bottom of why it took so damn long for the TV show to come out. All 3 original Tak games had come and gone before the show arrived, meaning it released after Tak had its time in the sun. Tak 2: The Staff of Dreams came out on October 11, 2004 for home consoles and Game Boy Advance. The game actually got a second life when THQ ported it to PSN in 2011 as a PS2 classic, but it would end up removed from the store due to THQ's bankruptcy a couple of years later. Tak 2 was first publicly announced on April 23, 2004, with THQ promising to show off the game at that year's installment of E3. Tak had made a decent enough splash in his debut, so THQ were more than happy to bring back Avalanche for the home console version and Helix for the GBA. I've brought this up a bunch of times during my videos, but the biggest killer for a lot of Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network games is that there's no continuity with developers. There are a bunch of reasons why the original Tak trilogy is more fondly remembered than pretty much any other cartoon game, but one of the big things is that a single developer got to hone and polish their ideas for the series. It's what sets Tak apart from Ben 10. In the PS1 and PS2 era, developers, particularly 3D platformer developers, were known for absolutely insane outputs. Naughty Dog released Crash 1-3 and Team Racing in 4 consecutive years, and followed up with 3 Jak games in 4 years. Their counterparts at Insomniac released the original Spyro trilogy in back-to-back-to-back years, and then went one better by doing 4 straight years of Ratchet & Clank games. For whatever reason, developers had these mascot platformer franchises on a never-ending treadmill. Naturally, the second tier of platformers tried to copy it, which is why you had a glut of Ty the Tasmanian Tiger games dropping all of a sudden. Tak wasn't an exception to this either. Development actually started on Tak 2 before Tak and the Power of Juju even released, with the story concepts being conceived in the same month the original hit store shelves. Now, the pre-PS3 360 Wii era was considerably easier to develop for, which is a big reason why these developers could constantly churn out games. Having said that, developing a sequel in under a year is a big task for the top tier dev studios, let alone the mid tier. Thankfully, critics loved Tak 2 for the most part. It landed a 7.5 average review score, which thrusts it into the upper echelon of Nick games, and puts it basically on par with the original, if not a little higher. Where the series seemed to falter a little more is in the GBA version. According to Game Rankings, Tak 2 had a 5.6 average review score, while Metacritic looks even worse with a 4.5. I can't even sugarcoat that. This is an insane drop. The first game was reviewed over 30 times and grabbed a 7.9 average. I don't know if I can recall a sequel dropping 3.5 review points. It's the equivalent of a perfect 10 game having its sequel flop to a 6.5. I'm a massive fan of the first GBA Tak game, I'm praying to all of the Juju out there, this is one of the cases where it seems like the critics just completely missed the mark. With about a year to get this game out the door, Helix didn't try to get too ambitious. Maybe they learned from their weird decision to rewrite the rulebook with Breaking the Rules and Shadow Showdown. Staff of Dreams on GBA is a pretty standard 2D platformer. A to jump, B to attack, go from left to right until you finally reach the end goal. The problem with a tight development window is that annoying little issues from the original game slip into the sequel. One of my biggest pet peeves, not just for the handheld but for the home console release of Power of Juju 2, was that the reach of Tak's melee attack was way too small. This issue hasn't been addressed with the follow-up. Tak's main method of attack is smacking enemies with a glorified stick, but this stick is too damn small. As a consequence, going head to head with enemies never feels smooth. That's not to say everything is the same in Tak 2. Holding B will perform a charged attack, which is sort of a holdover from the first game, but a slightly different implementation. Tak can also glide by holding A after doing a double jump. Helix should be commended again for their work on the platforming mechanics. This game controls so tightly, and I have no reservations about comparing it to any of its heavyweight contemporaries at the time. Killing things with Tak may be a chore, but jumping around with him is a joy. Arguably the biggest change in this sequel ties into the charge attack and glide. Performing these actions starts draining a brand new mana bar. You'll be constantly replenishing this through vials that are dropped by defeated enemies or by entering the dream world, which is also a big new addition. This mechanic brings with it another new meter. Periodically you'll come to these spots that fill up this green vial. Once filled, you can press R to go into the dream world, allowing you to occasionally jump on platforms that weren't there in the normal world. On top of that, bubbles of mana will float around in the dream world, giving you an extra way to fill up that meter. This entire system basically shows off just how much Tak has grown since the first game. When we first meet him, he's an unlikely hero, but now he's honed his skills and is able to take advantage of Juju magic with ease. Because we're dealing with a platformer here, most of the Juju magic allows you to move past a seemingly impenetrable roadblock. The first game had you collecting sheep, but here you'll be using them as a launch pad. It's an attempt to emphasize Tak's connection with animals, something we'll touch on a lot more in the home console version. At certain sections you'll be able to ride animals, 3 specific animals to be precise. To say this whole system was poorly thought out would be an understatement. Let's start with the bear and turtle, as they're essentially the exact same thing with a quick palette swap. You'll come across some water sections and seemingly need to jump onto a bear or turtle to get across. First issue with this is that neither animal is necessary to move past this. If you want to, you can get past it on your own. Sure, the game throws in a strong current to push you back and guide you towards using the animals to move forward. However, spamming jump will get you where you need to go. The big speed bump will be dispatching enemies while doing this. You'd probably think this is yet another deliberate design choice to push players towards using the animals. But dealing with enemies while riding the bear and turtle are just as clunky. You can't attack the enemies while riding, so you need to jump off, manage to kill the enemy, then hop back on the animal. This whole idea is a great example of why insanely tight deadlines will always result in a finished product that is lesser than what it could have been with some more time. The bear and turtle scream of Helix devs taking a look at Avalanche's work, freaking out because their game hasn't implemented Tak's relationship with animals, so they shoehorn something in that doesn't actually make sense when you take a step back. I will admit the bird is kinda cool and you're absolutely forced to use it, as Tak will end up falling to his death without it. But even then, it's not all that noteworthy as you quickly flap past some enemies and go back to your regularly scheduled gameplay. It reeks of padding. Alongside mana vials, enemies will occasionally drop health vials too, but it seemed kind of unnecessary. The majority of enemies drop health when defeated, so I found that I never really needed to replenish my health via these. They mostly just sat unused in my inventory for the entire game. Strangely, Tak 2 isn't a linear game. Instead of funneling you from level to level, you get a little overworld. When everything starts, you'll get 3 levels to choose from. Beating one of these opens up a path to an entire world, which then gives you 2 branching paths to fight through. At first, I thought the game was allowing me to pick and choose which levels I wanted to play through, and I'd be able to skip significant portions of the levels in the game here. Despite making it seem like you can skip half the game, you actually need to complete every single level. You just get the choice to do them out of order for some reason. This really doesn't make sense, and again goes back to rushed design choices. Things are being flung at the wall and not given a second glance, creating a lot of elements that exist but have no real purpose. Once you beat every level in a single area, you're taken to a final level referred to as a rift. These play out like a pretty normal level, but once you reach the very end, instead of being teleported back to the overworld, you need to wake up these little guys, then sprint back to the start of the level in a race against the time limit. Once you know everything, the rift levels are pretty straightforward in their premise. Unfortunately, Helix doesn't explain any of that, and you're left to figure it out in real time the first time you play through a rift. Again, it's clunky stuff like this that could have easily been fixed if they weren't making a game within a year. The rift levels are the only part of the entire game that could be considered hard. Specifically, the race back to the start of the level will challenge you most times. It can be a little jarring when every other level in the game is really easy, but it's not that big of a deal. After conquering a rift, you'll move back to the overworld and onto one of the other 2 areas and repeat the process. You'll also notice that there are some weird spots on the overworld that aren't levels. Because Helix wanted to give me PTSD, they brought back the Yorbles, but instead of being a required collectible, they're a form of currency. You'll collect these while in the dream world and then come to these spots on the overworld that function like the game corner in older Pokemon games. There's a roulette game where you can grow your Yorble count with seemingly no downside. I assume Helix didn't want to include actual gambling, so they made it impossible to lose Yorbles. This means you can grind infinite Yorbles here with no consequences. Giving the Yorbles a purpose is the shop that is attached to the casino. Here you can buy health and mana vials, as well as some other power-up potions. Difficulty doesn't exist in GBA Staff of Dreams, but if you were somehow struggling, this mechanic puts a nail in that coffin. Even without grinding Yorbles, I was able to purchase a full inventory of mana vials, making it so I could refill that meter whenever I wanted. I haven't painted a very flattering picture of THQ's sophomore adventure on the GBA, and that's because the game is very lackluster, especially as a follow-up to one of my favourite Nick games I've played so far. Almost every aspect, except for maybe the platforming, just feels a step off. The need to be pixel perfect when climbing down ladders, these platforms you have to inch yourself across gaps with, you're constantly being bombarded with clunky gameplay, at least initially. I was so disappointed with this game, and it was seriously in contention to be one of the worst sequels I've ever experienced. But then I beat the first area and everything sort of started to get better. I went with the left path when starting the game, and this collection of levels just sucked so hard. The other 2 areas felt considerably better. They didn't magically fix the core issues of Staff of Dreams, but I actually started to feel myself experiencing something that resembled fun. I can't help but wonder what my overall feeling towards the game would be if I chose this world second or last. Would I have been more positive? Regardless, the game is always super simplistic and levels are so samey, particularly in their dedicated area. I get sticking to a singular theme, but these levels don't do anything to separate themselves from one another. It all feels like one long, continuous level. When you do change the scenery for levels, the basic formula is never played with. All you do is run right, ignore most of the enemies, come to a roadblock that will be solved by a Juju magic ability, refill your Juju mana and Dreamworld ability, and then repeat that sequence for a few minutes. Helix really whiffed it on the Juju magic abilities. They play such a minor role, relegated to being as interesting as the ability to jump. I'm sure some version of this system could have been designed to really give Staff of Dreams a unique edge. Helix consistently does a fantastic job of never stranding a player without Juju magic. Whenever you need to use a Juju ability, you can be sure that the tools you need to refill the meter are right around you. This kinda goes a little too far though, to the point where there's no excuse to not have a full mana meter 99% of the time. Like I mentioned earlier, the game gives out huge chunks of mana when you're in the dream world. You're using your dream world ability constantly, so naturally you're finding spots to refill it constantly too, even more so than the dedicated mana refilling spots. There's nothing stopping you from going into the dream world as much as needed to keep your mana topped up. Once I realised this, I played with a constantly full mana bar, which made me question why Juju Magic was even a limited ability. It feels like yet another aspect that didn't get enough scrutiny because of a rushed development cycle. One of the most exciting things about the original THQ game on GBA was the level of production quality. Not only did it look and sound great, but it had a level of flair and extra dedication to storytelling that you don't often see in handheld games around this time. So it's unfortunate to see Staff of Dreams not reach those heights, let alone surpass them. This game has almost no story if I'm being honest. The first THQ game had a persistent narrative with a few twists and turns. Here you get a singular story dump before you start, and that's about it. Once you're done with the opening story, you play through 18 levels back to back without a single line of dialogue. It creates a really weird feeling where you're not even sure why you're doing any of this as THQ. The only information you really have is that THQ had a weird dream, and some strange stuff is happening in the dream world. It's all spoken about vaguely and then never followed up on. Worst of all, there's no antagonist. Well, until you beat all available levels, and suddenly Tlaylock shows up, kidnaps Locke, and makes you go through a couple more levels. The player is aware of Tlaylock's presence for roughly 5 minutes before you've beaten the game. It just doesn't work and again reeks of a rushed development. While not being as beautiful as the original, in my opinion, Staff of Dreams still looks fantastic. The game's style actually reminds me a lot of the original Rayman game. Certainly not as pretty, but it just feels like they took inspiration from that sort of style. Similarly, the score for the game is really good. They did a great job of capturing the essence of each area with the songs. THQ 2 on GBA is a cautionary tale of a truncated development cycle. After what Helix created with the original game, there's no reason why this should have been such a dramatic step back. Obviously I'm playing a bit of armchair developer here, but almost every single one of my negatives for Staff of Dreams seems like it could have been eradicated if Helix had been given more time. If they'd been able to step back and really analyse each aspect of the game, I'm confident they would have picked up on and tweaked these to create a much better final product. Things like the mana meter being pretty much irrelevant, Yorble collecting being broken, and THQ's link with animals feeling completely tacked on, feel like they could have been cleaned up without drastically reworking the game. I'm certainly not as down on the game as the 4.5 average Metacritic score, but it easily misses the bar set by the original. I had a love-hate relationship with the first THQ home console game, so if Staff of Dreams follows that trend on exactly the same tight development timeline, we're in for some trouble here.
You've been asleep for 16 days!
So? Does that mean crazy people can come and shove their moist, stinking pit in my face?
After spending the entirety of Power of Juju being thrust into the deep end out of nowhere, THQ understandably wants some peace and quiet in his life. Sucks to be him though, because he's about to get the complete opposite. THQ finds himself stuck in a dream for 16 days. Jabulba and Locke don't seem too pressed by this, considering their friend is essentially in a coma for unknown reasons. We quickly discover that THQ has been sucked into the dream world and is being tasked with saving a princess, a job he wants no part of. He initially tells the seemingly omniscient, disembodied voice that he has no interest in saving the princess.
What say you, great and mighty warrior of the Pupununu people? Will you bring your wits, your strength, and your courage to bear on this sacred mission?
Nah, don't think so.
It's the one and only Digo Double G.
But some good old-fashioned death threats get THQ to take on the quest. That's the setup here for Staff of Dreams. It's pretty similar to the GBA version, but is expanded upon with far more depth. Avalanche has also given THQ some considerable growth for the sequel. THQ's got a mana meter here again, but has significantly more abilities stemming directly from it. Interestingly, he also gets a glide ability here like in the GBA, but it's detached from the mana system. While handy, it also seems pretty out of place like this. Just makes Tak seem like he randomly got the ability to float. The Juju abilities Tak gained in between games are one of the most notable factors at play here. Not only has he been given a lot more variety in the gameplay, but it does a lot to make you feel like Tak has grown. In the first game, Tak is flying by the seat of his pants, thrust into a journey that seems too great for him until we find out he's the prophesied chosen one. With Staff of Dreams, you get the sense that he's been honing his craft and has started to become comfortable with his powers. And this ties right into the combat, which has been improved out of sight. The first game really suffered from Tak's melee attacks being too short and a little clunky to use. Staff of Dreams rectifies that and then adds so many new wrinkles. One of the best additions is that Tak has a ranged projectile attack seamlessly added into his arsenal. You can go from smacking enemies to shooting balls of light at the single click of a button. A change like that means the way you face enemies is much more fluid than it was in the past. On top of that, you then get the bowlers, which is a dedicated ranged attack that you can switch between. You'll throw these at enemies to tie them up or bring them close to you, while occasionally being used to help Tak clear large gaps. But the upgrades don't stop there. Staff of Dreams sprinkles in a bunch of special attacks that are activated with different combinations of buttons. It's pretty tropey stuff, like giving Tak a move that has a wider area of effect, mid-air attacks that target enemies that are in the air. Nothing revolutionary, but they're all effective at making the combat so much more interesting. Because at the end of the day, combat has zero depth in this game. Specific enemies don't really require specific attacks, and the combat pretty much boils down to you just mashing the attack button. What the special moves do is they mask this lack of depth, covering it up with flashy animations and satisfying attacks that make the 10 millionth encounter with the game's repetitive enemies genuinely enjoyable. This is probably the most I could ask for from combat in a Tak game. You're never going to get a system with loads of nuance, so having it filled with plenty of options to prevent enemy encounters being dull is the next best thing. My biggest gripe might be how they handle upgrades. You obviously don't start out with a full arsenal of moves. Tak is drip-fed new attacks, but in the most ham-fisted way. At seemingly random points, the game will pause, almost making you think something is wrong, before giving you access to a brand new attack or even upgrading your health. It almost feels like the game should have had a little experience meter ticking along, kind of in a similar vein to what you see in the Ratchet & Clank series. Not the biggest problem in the world, but I would have liked to see Tak's progression tied to the gameplay. Another big change I felt in Staff of Dreams is that the level design is much more linear, at least for the first couple of acts. Power of Juju's levels weren't exactly big sprawling environments, but the decision to make Yawble collecting and returning to levels a thing resulted in levels having branching paths and new areas opening up. For most of the sequel's runtime, you're being shuffled from level to level. This is entirely a linear journey that does away with having a hub world to return to constantly, so even when later levels become a little more open, it still feels very linear. That's not really a negative though, just a point of difference. In fact, it might actually be a positive for me personally, because I despise the Yawble collecting of the first game. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. Avid Tak fans will spot plenty of familiar elements from the first game. Naturally, Juju spirits play a starring role again. Frequently, Tak will discover a shrine followed by a totem that will summon a Juju. Just like the first game, these Jujus generally help Tak, but not in the way he first expected. A few familiar faces return through this too. Feathers are back again, replenishing your health and mana, but this time Avalanche made sure to make it much clearer to the player that they were restoring your health. I also felt like feathers were much more frequent, which I think comes down to the increased scope of the Juju abilities. While Staff of Dreams feels familiar, it's constantly diverging from the original game in its design. One of the biggest focus areas for Avalanche in this sequel was emphasizing Tak's connection to animals. This was included in the first game with the puzzle solving through monkeys, sheep, chickens, but I get the feeling Avalanche didn't believe they nailed this the way they wanted to. Animals play a part in pretty much everything you do here. Early on it plays out almost identically to the first game. Tak will take advantage of animals loitering about levels to get to new areas or solve a puzzle. Most of the early levels see you combining the unintended powers of bears, squirrels, bees, skunks and boars. The different animals in the original were kept mostly separate, but from the start of Staff of Dreams, you're combining these different animals to keep moving forward on Tak's journey. Puzzle solving is the crux of the game. Then you've got Jabulba turning into a flea. This was clearly done to give Jabulba an excuse to tag along for Tak's journey, without needing to have him randomly disappear every time a gameplay segment happens. As a flea, you'll shoot Jabulba at animals, prompting them to do various actions. Shooting Jabulba at the animals can be really clunky, but never to the point where it causes major issues. So as I said, Staff of Dreams starts off being well and truly a puzzle game. I actually really enjoyed this early direction because it felt pretty unique for a 3D mascot platformer of the time. Look at Tak's contemporaries. Ratchet and Jack had a pretty heavy combat focus, Sly was doing stealth, and Crash and Spyro were always seen as the most platformer focused of the bunch. Focusing on puzzles would allow Tak to carve out its own niche in a crowded genre full of heavyweights. Super smart from Avalanche. The unique take actually helped paper over the cracks of what is, a lot of the time, some really bad puzzle gameplay. The puzzle solving via animal abilities can be ridiculously unclear at times because the game doesn't explain or even guide you towards the full extent of each animal's ability. For example, you'll first use the bear as a bounce pad, but you quickly come to a section where even that extra bounce won't help you. The solution is to bounce up and down on the bear 3 times without moving, which prompts the bear to catch Tak and throw him across the gap. How does Avalanche reasonably expect a player to learn about this? The game doesn't even hint at this in the slightest. Then there's moments that probably fell victim to the short development cycle. The timing window of some of the more time-sensitive puzzles can be ridiculous. One section tells the player they need to navigate a combination of bees, alligators, and sheep to progress. Doing this was so awkward and unenjoyable, only for me to discover it wasn't necessary. The game implied I needed to carry the sheep across safely, only for me to find out the sheep were irrelevant. I still have no idea why Avalanche set this section out like I needed to do anything other than just run forward. One of my least favourite sections of the game was inside Jabulba's brother's house, who is lazily named JB for the purpose of a 2-second gag. This section drags on for an excruciating amount of time and features numerous awkward and clunky sections. The puzzle solving is heavily flawed and at times really bad, but I was kind of okay with it purely because of how unique it felt. Unfortunately, Staff of Dreams is one of the most unfocused games I've ever played. Initially, Avalanche tried to balance this puzzle gameplay with combat sections, which is where the dream world comes into play. The dream world is actually where this supposed princess is being kept, so Tak can only make progress on that journey while asleep. When he's awake, he's seeking out JB, who is supposed to be knowledgeable about dreams. Tak must be suffering from some serious CTE, because rather than having Tak go to sleep, the game's story always calls for him to get knocked the fuck out to initiate a dream level. These levels are essentially combat challenges. You're put into these trippy worlds where you go against monster closet after monster closet, linked together via very light platforming. They also serve as an introduction to a new type of attack a lot of the time. These sections are really unremarkable and aren't really that fun. When you're forced to just do combat instead of having it broken up with puzzles, you really start to feel how shallow the combat system is. But if this was the only major gameplay change up in Staff of Dreams, it wouldn't be too bad. The pacing feels kind of right, bouncing back and forth between puzzle levels and combat levels. The only problem is that this isn't the only change up. In fact, it's far from it. There's the waterfall levels that are tossed in randomly. These are long sections where Tak is thrown into the water and needs to dodge obstacles being thrust at him. These are really long, give you no checkpoints, and are a massive difficulty spike compared to the gameplay you'd previously been doing. I did get a slight kick out of the fact that these levels are basically just shmups without the sh part. Here we've got ourselves some obligatory mup levels. Avalanche then randomly decide they've had enough of the dream world being combat focused, introducing a level where you drive a catapult around. This controls quite poorly and they basically make you do platforming with the bloody thing. It ended up tipping over from being an annoying level to completely batshit insane thanks to this weird platforming. I ended up sort of enjoying it in a so bad it's good type of way. Then they tossed that aside too to slam in some chase sections in the dream world. Back in the real world, Tak will be given the power to turn into a bear, squirrel, frog, and boar towards the end of the game. It further emphasizes Tak's relationship with animals, but by this point, every new addition feels like Avalanche just flinging shit at the wall randomly. The biggest issue is every time Staff of Dreams introduces a new idea, it abandons its old ones. You start the game using Jabulba and the animals for puzzle solving a lot, and then you sort of just drop them entirely. The only time I'd activate Fleeja Bulba in the second half of the game was by accident, which would then remind me of its existence. Same thing goes for the Dream World. It's all about combat until it isn't about combat ever again. The biggest issue with this game is that it doesn't know what it wants to be. Sometimes it wants to be a puzzle platformer, sometimes it wants to be a pure platformer, and then you'll get a combat arena section that feels ripped from Ratchet, and you get the vibe that the game wants to be combat focused. These ideas never combine. They feel like individual elements that have been added to the game without any cohesion or thought of combining them together. It's like if somebody used a Mad Lib to design a video game. Staff of Dreams gameplay is flawed fun, and so is the narrative. The biggest improvement here is the amount of cutscenes. The first game had gorgeous cutscenes that were used sparingly, but here they're used frequently. Seeing the amount of cutscenes on display, you'd assume we've got a much meatier story, but it's actually not the case. Most cutscenes don't really push the narrative. You get a bunch of story at the start of the game, then not a whole lot until you reach JB's house, where you get more info dumped on you. Don't expect a rich narrative like some of the AAA studios were pushing at this time. Making up for this is the increased presence of Locke. He was an afterthought who barely appeared in the first game other than to shit himself. Staff of Dreams sees Locke tagging along, continually fucking up everything he tries to do. The full extent of his himbo nature is on display here, and it's a genuine joy to see.
I bet you can't tell what I'm thinking now.
You're thinking, why am I pole vaulting when I've never done this before, And now you're thinking, it is a long way to the bottom.
Slaylock's involvement in the plot isn't revealed at the very last second like the GBA port, so it's a little bit better from a structural point of view, but overall the game's narrative is a miss. I mostly felt like I was just shuffling from level to level randomly. While the story is a bit of a letdown, Avalanche haven't compromised on the production values with THQ's sophomore game. The soundtrack once again captures that perfect jungle adventure vibe. It really gives the THQ series its own sense of identity. Graphics look really nice too, especially when you upscale those models to 1080p. A real shout out to the water here. I may have hated the sections it was featured in, but I'll be damned if the water here isn't some of the best of its time. Definitely scores a place in the video game water Hall of Fame. Levels don't have the same scope of a Ratchet or Jack, but by choosing to be smaller scale, they're able to do some really visually impressive things. It's got occasional hiccups where it feels like they stretch themselves thin, like parts of levels that feel as if concept art was pasted on, but even these look pretty nice, even though they stand out like a sore thumb.
Moon Juju, what are you doing here?
I've come to help you, Tak, but we have to hurry. I can only stay a short time in the world of dreams.
I am desperately trying to love the THQ franchise. There's just this intangible quality about it that makes me want to be completely obsessed with it. But playing the first two console games, I haven't been majorly impressed. Staff of Dreams specifically cannot get out of its own way for more than 5 minutes. Avalanche tries to shovel in way too many ideas for a single game. I doubt even Insomniac could have pulled off a cohesive game with all of the elements at play here. Maybe the issue is short development time. It would explain why you have such jarring moments like the entire game being linear, until all of a sudden you have some more open levels where you collect 20 shards. It really feels like this is a game that was made without anybody communicating to each other about what they were working on. And I'm probably going to catch a lot of criticism for this. I mean, that's basically a foregone conclusion because apparently offering any criticism of a beloved Nickelodeon game is grounds for people to lose their minds in the comment section. Staff of Dreams isn't awful, just painfully mediocre. I'd probably put it above the first game because it has much higher highs than Power of Juju, and the lows aren't nearly as low. It's just a shame that Avalanche can't seem to focus their creative energy. They seem so close to being able to nail a legitimately amazing THQ game. Next time, I'll be looking at All Grown Up Express Yourself. This was the one and only console game based on the spin-off Rugrats series that thrust the babies into their tween phase, and the final Rugrats game period. What kind of note will Nickelodeon's iconic franchise go out on? Make sure you subscribe to find out.